It's an honor and privilege to share with you today. As Bob Warwick says, I've known Bob my entire life. I'm grateful to consider him a mentor, and he and his family have been tremendously kind and generous to my parents, my family on the mission field for over 40 years, supporting us now. So I can definitely say, from behalf of my father, and he'd probably want me to say after that introduction, that without Bob's help and support, I know our family probably would not have been able to do a lot of what we did on the mission field for the last 38, 39 years. Today I'd like to share my testimony a bit with you and just a bit of my unique life story, and hopefully I'm going to stick to my time limitation. So I have written some things because I don't want to digress and want to make sure that we all get out of here at a reasonable time. As Bob said, my father was actually raised in a Jewish family. My father was a Jew. He was raised in Long Island in New York, and he spent the first 18 years of his life in Long Island. He was a very competitive individual. He was an overachiever. He was a New York State wrestling champion in high school, and to this day he was in the Hall of Fame of his high school 50 years later, and his record in high school as a wrestler, and then he was 84-4, and I think his early losses were mostly his freshman year when he was wrestling seniors. So he was an extremely competitive individual, and he later wrestled Division I wrestling when he was in college as well at Lehigh University. He has an MBA from Harvard and studied also at Cambridge. So he was an extremely highly intelligent, motivated Jewish New Yorker at the time. But he went off the deep end, and his testimony would take a very long time, so I won't go into it. But it experimented with drugs like so many people in the 60s, and he had a radical encounter with God where God transformed his life completely. And shortly thereafter, he moved to Wilmington, where he met my mother. And my mother comes from a wonderful Christian family here in Wilmington, North Carolina. My grandparents were married for 65 years before my grandfather's death, and they lived in Wilmington almost the entirety of their marriage. The Pravat family, which some of you who are longtime people may know of them, but and they were always kind of the home away from home, and so was Wilmington throughout our entire time as missionaries, being able to come and be able to spend time at my mother's parents' house was kind of a source of stability for us as children when we were just moved around a lot, as all missionary kids are. But my mother graduated from New Hanover High School, and as Bob said, he taught her in Sunday school, so she was here all throughout her childhood. She had a bachelor's degree from UNCW, and then she had a master's degree from UNC Chapel Hill as well. But they met in a Bible study here in Wilmington, and shortly thereafter, the Lord called them to missions. So when myself and my two younger brothers, I was almost 4 years old, and my other brothers were 2 and 1, my parents moved and drove with everything they owned at the time in a Ford station wagon to Mexico, 3,500 miles with 3 boys under the age of 4, all because they had received a word from the Lord that they were to be missionaries. And they really did not have that much support. It's a leap of faith. I think a lot of their friends in the Bible study they were in here in Wilmington thought they had completely lost their minds at the time. And I spent the next 4 years of my life in Mexico, in Puebla, which is a couple hours south of Mexico City, and did kindergarten, first and second grade in Mexico. My father, at that time, he taught economics at the University of the Americas in Puebla, and he started a small church which consisted mostly of his university students. So he used a lot of his university education. The Lord helped use that to reach the people around us. And so he would invite them, as usually happened. These churches would start in our living room, and they always progressed from there. So in Mexico, of course, that meant my brothers and I would hang around all these university students a lot. In Spain, that ended up meaning something very different, as I'll describe later. But I remember being tremendously impacted at one point between about the ages of 6 and 7 by the gospel message as my father was sharing it with the students and accepting Christ into my life as well. So as I can say, from the very earliest ages, I was able to see in various different cultures the gospel being presented and transforming people's lives, and realize my own need for God in my life and my need for God's grace. My parents, due to the nature of our visa in Mexico, would make the trip back to Wilmington with that station wagon almost every summer, which was a 3,000-mile round trip with the kids. And in the summer of 1981, my youngest brother was born after being in Mexico for 3 years. And we spent about 3 months in the U.S. My grandfather had insisted that should happen because if he wasn't born in America, he could not be president of the United States. So, a little aside. Of course, that was never meant to be either. But, so we went back to Mexico, this time with 4 kids, my parents, one of them being about 6 to 8 weeks old, and drove all the way back to Puebla, 3,000 miles again, with 4 children. To be honest, some of those memories, I guess, are great memories for me. I've visited Mexico a couple of times since then, and obviously your memory of something when you're that young is always different than the reality when you return. And of course, everything changes and is always changing in this world. But in 1982, 83, my parents were back in the United States, here in Wilmington, for some time. Then they went to Pennsylvania and joined WEC, Worldwide Evangelization for Christ, the mission, and spent 1 year training as missionaries up there, and I did 3rd grade up in Pennsylvania. And it was at about that time that they felt the Lord had called them to Spain. And so in 1983, my family moved to Spain. And, initially, where they remain to this day, my father is still in Spain, 35 years later, 34, 35 years later, my father still lives in Spain and is serving in Spain. But initially, my father and mother wanted to do the exact same thing they had done in Mexico. They wanted to reach university graduates, the educated, and perhaps start another church also consisting of students. And but when they arrived in Spain, it was only a few years after the Franco dictatorship, which had finished in 1975, really, and Spain did not really have a democracy, but only about 7 or 8 years at that time, and their constitution was extremely new at the time. So most of the younger generation at that time, they basically were glad to have this newfound sense of freedom, and they were, exploring a lot of the same, crazy things that we did in the U.S. back in the 60s, but in Spain they kind of delayed it an extra 20 years, and they took it to a much greater degree because they'd all been living under this dictatorship. So there was a tremendous widespread, drug epidemic in Spain in the early 1980s, alcohol, and all of this coincided, of course, with the AIDS epidemic, which was prevalent in the 1980s and which was still very new and which there wasn't a lot of medication for. So as my father and mother, along with a few other missionaries that they had connected with in Spain, began to attempt to reach out to all these university students, they showed absolutely no interest in the gospel or in anything that that my father was sharing, and there seemed to be almost no open doors. And it wasn't but about 18 months or so into their time in Spain, after the Lord kept putting one after another drug addict and marginalized people in their path, prostitutes, alcoholics, homeless, that the Lord really spoke to my parents in a very profound way in their kitchen and said, if you'll just change who you think I'm calling you to, and actually change your focus and begin to reach out to the broken, to addicts, to prostitutes, to homeless, and attempt to reach these people with the gospel and build a church out of these people, then you're going to have an incredible ministry and you're going to have a great church here in Spain. And they still believe that was one of the clearest times they ever heard in their life from God. And so they did. And it was at the beginning, because we didn't have the infrastructure and we didn't have a program ourselves, what that meant was sending some of these other addicts to a couple existing Christian rehabilitation centers. And that, did or didn't work out. Half the time, my parents, the first few times, would drive 300 miles. My father drive some of these addicts up in his van to some of these other locations, and sometimes they'd beat them back to Madrid themselves on public transportation. So anyway, but that's the nature of working with this type of people. And it was a learning experience in the beginning. But one of the single missionaries, who would have been in his late 20s at the time, working alongside my father, little by little, as we were doing street outreach, we'd invite them to our home. My parents would on Friday evenings. And my brothers and I, we'd mostly just play, foosball and other board games and things in my bedroom with all these addicts. And then after, eat appetizers, etc. And then we'd have a Bible study church meeting in the living room afterwards. So that was one of my early memories as a child at about the age of 8, 9, and 10, was just, playing foosball and doing all sorts of things, entertaining the addicts for 30, 45 minutes, an hour before the meeting, possibly after the meeting. And then there was this middle time where they'd be connected with the gospel. After doing all these other things perhaps in my bedroom. So my parents obviously opened up their home in a very real way, and their 4 children got to socialize with a lot of these people that we were trying to reach at the time with the gospel. But the first person that Battelle helped was this addict named Raul. And he had a court date, and he had nowhere to stay, and he begged this young single missionary who lived very close to us, about a quarter mile away, whether he could stay in his house. And on a whim, probably it was the Holy Spirit, before Lindsay could even think or realize what he was saying, he actually said, "Sure, you can stay in my house until your court date," which was a few weeks away. And so my father and Lindsay began doing, these intensive, 2-3 hours a day, working with Raul, giving him Bible studies, etc. And he kind of was his shadow. And Lindsay said, "Fine, if you're going to stay in my house, you can't use drugs while you're there. So if I go to the bank, you have to follow me. If I do this, you have." And he basically became his shadow for that time. But after his court, the judge actually showed leniency and mercy and could see he was coherent and sober at the time of his trial. And so he ended up spending almost 3 months in Lindsay's apartment and suggested, what you guys have done for me, why can't we, I have so many friends on the street that really need a lot of help, why can't you, let's invite someone else into your apartment too. So Lindsay said, "Sure." And they invited another guy, Paco, who was the second addict in Battelle. And he, after he graduated from Battelle, was in Battelle for almost 10 years. And after he graduated, started his own business which he ran for about almost 20 years until the day he passed on to be with the Lord recently, a couple years ago. But he had been clean for 30 years prior to that. But so they took him on, and then a third, fourth, fifth. Finally, they had 7 addicts living in Lindsay's small, I believe, might have been a 3-bedroom apartment. So 8 total, including Lindsay, but it was starting to scare it was a big 10-story high-rise. They were sharing elevators with a lot of, other, grandmothers, et cetera, other Spaniards. They weren't particularly thrilled about this idea. So shortly thereafter, Battelle got its first property outside the city, which is normally a more suitable place for where you would like to have a halfway house or a Christian discipleship center to help people with that are dealing and suffering with recovery and addiction. But the way Battelle began really was a simple act of kindness and love, attempting to help the one addict who God had put in Lindsay and my father's path, inviting him into their home, inviting a few of his friends, and it expanded. And from that point, and without going into a lot of the history, 32 years ago when Lindsay first took Raul into his home. And now it's in over 24 countries, well over 100 cities around the world, a couple hundred different communities. And there are currently over 2,500 addicts living in Battelle residential community today. And I would say probably 250,000 people have come through Battelle over the last 250,000 addicts around these 24 countries in the world over the past 32 years. And it just started as a simple act of kindness, trying to help one guy for a couple weeks who needed somewhere to stay before a court case. But the Holy Spirit had other plans, God had other plans. And one of the things that I can most remember, and I hopefully am not going too long, in my childhood is that so many of these people, addicts, former addicts who had been radically transformed by God's saving grace, became some of my closest friends throughout my teenage years and later in my 20s, 30s, and even into this present day. I spent hundreds of hours in their residential communities as a child, as a teenager, playing soccer with them, which of course anyone knows that's the world kind of sport. Church meetings with them, eating with them, sleeping in their residential communities. But in the late 1980s and early 90s, the AIDS epidemic was extremely prevalent in Spain, and so many of these individuals whose lives had been transformed by God's grace and who had been freed from their addiction and their recovery through just poor choices that they had made when they were on the streets, they had contracted AIDS. And I remember at about the age of 10 or 11 going to my first funeral of one of our residents that we were trying to help, who had been a Christian, who was a church member, but they died due to some of the AIDS complications that resulted from things, decisions they had made even before coming to us. And from that point until my graduation from high school, I attended dozens more funerals, all of people whose lives had been radically transformed by God's grace, but who still lived with some of their consequences of their choices prior to their conversion. And particularly in the 80s, I don't think people were very wise, and especially not in Spain, with how they shared syringes, when they were injecting heroin. And that was predominantly the main people we were helping, were people who were heroin addicts and opioid users. And particularly, there was just not the same level, I guess, of hygiene or realization of the transmission of HIV and other STDs at the time. So it was, it was a sad reality, but it was also a beautiful reality in the sense that every single one of these people lived the last few years of their life in such a powerful and impactful way. They were so grateful that God's grace had touched and transformed their life, that they had come to saving knowledge of Christ. And in spite of the fact that I remember as a teenager going and visiting countless of these people in the hospital, most of them were a tremendous inspiration to me, in spite of the fact that they may have, weighed 90, 100, 110 pounds as a grown, adult male, and their body was completely, suffering tremendously due to their disease. Their hope, their eternal hope, was so evident in the joy in their lives from the knowledge of their salvation and the fact that God had transformed their life. And at one point in our church, it was so dramatic, the nature of how many of our members were suffering from a disease, that a Dutch filmmaker came to our church and did a documentary. This was, of course, before we became a little more skeptical of the intentions of the media, which I guess is always something to be skeptical of in this day and age. But he did a documentary called Half of Their Church Has AIDS, and it aired on Dutch television. And I'm not sure that he was exaggerating at that point, in terms of the quantity of people we were helping and the level of sickness. And I'm not saying all these things to even be morbid or anything, but as you all know, in this life, because of sin, because of the fall, each and every one of us, unless the Lord comes again soon, at one point or another is going to die, some of us in different ways. But I was very aware from a very early age, even in my childhood, of life, death, heaven, hell, and that made very real and clear to me the gospel message. And I think that's something that's very often missing now, particularly in today's generation, where we have this kind of postmodern culture, and we heard so many great talks, I guess, here from very recently from people trying to reach high schoolers and college students. But I can say one thing that coming into contact with all of this at such an early age revealed to me is this life really all that there is? And realizing that the tremendous hope that the gospel offered so many of these people as they suffered was something that was tremendously impactful for me as a child. However, really, and they served as tremendous inspiration to me throughout my childhood. Many of these addicts that supposedly had come to my father and Lindsay and others for help, but then God used them to actually touch us and help us and serve as inspiration to us as well, just for their radical abandonment and commitment to God in the final years of their life. But the event which really had the most profound impact on my childhood happened between my junior and senior year of high school. I was here in, actually my parents had come home to Wilmington on our furlough, and I actually got my driver's license at the time. I was 16 that summer, and it was only a couple days, actually, after getting my driver's license, that my mother left to go to a women's retreat. And my father decided that myself and my three brothers and the five of us were going to go to Kitty Hawk, and we were going to go on a camping trip. And this would be a wonderful male bonding event. And for whatever reason, Lord knows, you can't second guess, my father decided to let me drive. And and when you're 16, you're not very wise, to put it mildly, and you don't always think of the consequences of everything you're doing. And I still to this day don't really know exactly what happened. I either fell asleep at the wheel. I completely took my eyes off the road, that's for certain, but cannot recollect what happened those few seconds. But I went down an embankment and off the road. The vehicle flipped many times, and somehow, miraculously, my father, myself, and my two other brothers survived, but Timothy, youngest brother, died in a car accident as we were going on this camping trip. And he was only 9 years old at the time. So I was devastated by this death, as would any normal sibling would be. My immediate thought was I felt tremendous guilt for what I had done as I sat there looking at my brother when we got out of the car and realized that he was dead. And realized, my father has lost his son, my brothers have lost their brother. What's my mom going to think when she sees me for the next time after she gets back from this conference? And any number of things kind of crossing through my head. And I was, in spite of the fact that it was certainly nothing that I ever did intentionally, I realized if I had been attentive or alert or actually just driving properly, my brother would be alive. And of course, God, you can say God is sovereign, and in His grace certain things happen, and you can't really undo the past. But But I was tremendously, as devastated as I was, I'll never forget, the first reaction of my mother when she saw me and, was to hug me, to tell me how much she loved me with tears in her eyes and never blamed me. And I can say my mother, my father, my brothers, no one ever blamed me for this accident, and I certainly cannot say the same thing about myself. And no matter what anyone else said, and really even no matter what the Word of God said, because I knew the gospel very well, and I think so many of us as Christians know the gospel. We understand grace in abstract, but then when it comes to applying it specifically to our situation, it becomes sometimes much harder because we oftentimes are the last person to forgive ourselves when things go wrong. And although I can say that the unconditional love and grace and mercy I was shown by my other family members at the time, I think was in some sense a picture of the grace and love that God shows us as well. And it took a very long time for this truth to sink in, and for me to begin to accept God's grace and forgiveness for this and realize that Timothy probably himself, from where he's at in heaven also realizes it was not intentional and would forgive me as well. I returned to Spain, and then very briefly I'm going to kind of conclude here. Completed my senior year in high school, applied and was accepted to UNC Chapel Hill, and I left the surviving members of my family, was thousands of miles away from them, and I kind of basically dedicated myself to studying at that point because I was still kind of coping with grief and separation from parents, etc. Did very well in my studies, graduated with highest honors in mathematics, got a 12-month master's in accounting from Chapel Hill, while I was also teaching a class of freshman mathematics at UNC to students who were 1 or 2 years younger than me. That was definitely a challenging and interesting experience. As Bob said, I worked for 3 years after getting my master's degree at Arthur Andersen, got my CPA license. And even though I enjoyed mathematics, finance, business, accounting, I still always had the missions tug on my heart from all my time in Spain. So after about 3 years, I just decided that the Lord was calling me back into that. I got my master's in theology from Oxford University. My younger brother Jonathan's a Rhodes Scholar, and he also went to Carolina with me. And I remember visiting Oxford to visit him when he had his Rhodes Scholarship and thought, wow, this is a really, really fun city. Would be fun to get back here somehow. And when I met Naomi, who is now my wife, after spending a couple years in Spain helping my parents' ministry and traveling around Battelle, Europe, before going to Oxford, I would traveled and I lived with some of the men in Battelle, Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain for the next couple years. Was preaching with them, living with them, working with them, and helping with accounting and the international headquarters. Then I decided to, after meeting Naomi and she moved back to England, I thought, it's time. I'll get my master's in accounting at Oxford. My master's in theology at Oxford, and I'll be close to Naomi as well. So we were short. I got my MA in theology, married Naomi, and then briefly thereafter was in New York for almost 10 years, as Bob said, leading the Battelle Center there and pastoring their church. And ministry in the United States, in New York City, with all the complications that doing business and doing anything in New York demands, was definitely a challenge, to say the least. There's not always the same sense of gratitude as there is overseas when you go to help people in the U.S. But we led that for almost 9 or 10 years until the board of directors of the ministry thought that the money would be better spent by selling our property in New York and distributing the funds to missions. I definitely agreed with that as well. After the death of my mother 5 years ago, I think I'd reached a point where I recommended as well to the board that I thought that would be wise, and they thought so as well. So we've been in Wilmington now for almost 2.5, going on 3 years, my family and I. It's been an amazing transition. Doing full-time, what you would traditionally call ministry, but as we all know here in this group of businessmen, being full-time in business is also a ministry as well, in its own very different way. But, you know, one of the sad things I think in the U.S., and which I think we've seen so well by so many other speakers, is that as Christians we've surrendered too many areas of the culture to non-Christians. We've surrendered our universities, we've surrendered the media, we've surrendered, you know, even you look back, music, the greatest musicians of the last 500,000 years were all Christians. We've surrendered music, we've surrendered, one by one, we've surrendered different categories. We've surrendered oftentimes even the business world. And Christians are needed in every area of society to make their mark and to reach different areas of society. And it can often be just as challenging to start and run your own business as it is to be, you know, involved in ministry and as a missionary and otherwise, you know. And I'm certainly finding that to be the case as well myself now, learning to trust God and to serve Him wherever He places you, which right now is in my single-person small CPA firm here in Wilmington, North Carolina.